One winter morning, my billionaire grandfather spotted me walking down the road with my newborn in my arms. He stopped his car and rolled down the window. "Why are you walking in this weather?" he asked. "And where's the Mercedes I gave you?" I looked away and told him the truth. "I've never driven it. My sister has it." He went completely silent. Then he said, "I'll fix this tonight." I thought he meant a conversation. A few hours later, the police arrived. But before I tell you what happened that night, before I get to the forensic accountant who traced $40,000 through 8 months of transactions, before I tell you about the officer who showed up at my parents' front door, before I tell you about my sister standing in the driveway holding keys that were never hers, I need to take you back to the beginning, because what happened that January morning didn't start with a car. It started the day I trusted the wrong people with the most vulnerable version of myself I had ever been. My name is Olivia. I am 31 years old. I grew up in a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest, the eldest of 2 daughters. My father, Frank, worked in commercial insurance. My mother, Sandra, stayed home through most of my childhood and then moved into part-time bookkeeping once my sister Lauren and I were in high school. We lived in a 4-bedroom colonial on a quiet street. We had a yellow lab named Chester who died when I was 16 and who I still miss sometimes in a way I can't explain. My grandfather, my mother's father, was the outlier in this picture of normalcy. Warren Aldrich had built a logistics empire from a single freight brokerage he started at 24. By the time I was born, he had already sold the original company twice and reinvested into real estate, private equity, and regional manufacturing. He was not warm in the way that grandfathers in movies are warm. He did not ruffle hair or tell jokes, but he was present. He noticed things. And when he said he would do something, it happened. I met Daniel at 24 at a cookout thrown by a mutual friend. He was 4 years older than me, just back from his first deployment, and the calmest person I had ever been around. Not passive, calm. There is a difference. We were married 14 months after we met, in a small outdoor ceremony that my mother spent 6 months trying to expand into something larger, and that Daniel and I held firm on keeping simple. At the reception, my grandfather pulled me aside and pressed a card into my hand. A handwritten note. He had set up a trust account in my name as a wedding gift, $150,000, and the details would follow by mail. I thanked him. I put the card in my keepsake box. I did not think much more about it. The years that followed were good ones. We lived on base when Daniel was stateside, and in a small rented house near my hometown during his deployments. I worked as an office administrator for a pediatric practice, and I was good at it. Lauren, 3 years younger than me, had finished a communications degree and was living at home with my parents, working part-time and spending, from what I could observe, considerably more money than she made. I got pregnant at 28. It was planned. The pregnancy was uneventful. I worked until 36 weeks. Cole was born in September, 6 pounds, 11 ounces, Daniel's forehead, my mother's chin. The labor was long and the recovery harder than I'd anticipated, not dangerously so. But there was a physical and emotional weight to those first weeks that I had not been warned about adequately by anyone. Daniel was there for the first 6 weeks. Then he deployed. The orders had been set before the pregnancy. We had known. But knowing something is coming and feeling it arrive are two separate experiences. And when I watched his car pull out of my parents' driveway on a gray October morning, Cole asleep in my arms, Daniel turning once to look back at us, I felt a loneliness so specific and so total that it startled me. My parents' house was the plan because it made logistical sense. My lease near the base had ended. Moving in was supposed to be a bridge. 3 months, maybe 4, until Daniel returned and we sorted out something permanent. My mother had made it sound like the simplest thing in the world. What I did not understand until I was already inside it was that my mother had very specific ideas about who would be in charge of things once I arrived. It started small, the way these things always do. The first week, she handled the grocery run while I rested. Reasonable. The second week, she rearranged Cole's sleep setup while I was napping and presented it as a gift. The third week, she sat me down and explained that it would be more efficient if she managed the household spending. She would handle groceries, baby supplies, any needs. I wouldn't have to worry about it. She took my debit card. I want to stop here and explain why I handed it over, because I know how that sounds. But I was someone who had not slept more than 90 minutes consecutively in 3 weeks. I was someone who had cried in a grocery store parking lot twice that month for no specific reason. I was someone who desperately wanted to believe that the people around her were on her side. So I handed over the card and told myself it was temporary. My grandfather came to see Cole about a month after Daniel deployed. A Wednesday afternoon, unannounced, with a car service waiting in the driveway and a box of children's gifts someone else had selected. He held Cole for approximately 4 minutes, declared him healthy looking, and then pulled me aside before leaving. "The paperwork for the trust account should have reached you by now," he said. "$150,000, set up for you and for the child. Make sure you've read through all of it." I told him I would look into it. I had not received any paperwork. I did not know that yet. He also mentioned a car was coming, a gift, something practical. The Mercedes arrived 2 days later, silver, brand new, delivered by a man from the dealership who handed me the keys and drove away. I had never owned anything that nice in my life. That same evening, my mother sat me down at the kitchen table. The conversation was, on the surface, entirely reasonable. She pointed out that I was still in recovery, that driving with a newborn was stressful, that Lauren had a work commute and the car would be more sensible in Lauren's hands for now rather than sitting unused, just temporarily. I looked at Lauren, who was leaning against the counter looking at her phone. I said, "Okay, I want to be precise about what happened inside me when I said that. I did not agree. I did not think this was fair. But I had already learned in the weeks since I moved in that arguing with my mother produced a specific exhaustion distinct from ordinary tiredness. She would not yell. She would look at me with a particular expression, worried, slightly grieved, slightly superior, and the argument would would shift until it was about whether I was being rational, whether the stress was affecting my judgment, and I would end up apologizing. So I said okay. Lauren took the keys. I was given, without comment, a bicycle that had belonged to my father since approximately 2009. I need you to understand what the following months looked like from the inside, because from the outside they might have appeared relatively stable. I was living in a house with family. The baby was fed and warm. No one raised a hand to me. If you had observed us at the dinner table, you would have seen what looked like a family eating together. But inside that dynamic, I was disappearing. Every decision about Cole was gradually absorbed into my mother's orbit. She corrected how I held him. She would take him from my arms when he cried, not violently, but insistently, and soothe him in a way that suggested my method had been insufficient. At pediatric appointments, she would give the doctor information about Cole's routine that was not accurate, and when I tried to correct her, she would smile and say, "Olivia is still adjusting. She sometimes gets the details mixed up." The doctor would nod. My father was present in the way a painting on a wall is present. He occupied space. He watched the evening news. He grilled on weekends. He called Cole the little guy and appeared genuinely fond of him. But he did not intervene in anything, ever, and after a while I stopped expecting him to. He had made his peace with my mother's management of the household in some agreement that predated my awareness of it, and he was not going to renegotiate it on my behalf. Lauren drove the Mercedes every day, to work, to brunch, to weekend trips I wasn't invited on. She mentioned it in conversation the casual way you mention things that belong to you. "I need to get the Mercedes washed this weekend," and no one at the table reacted, including me. At one point, she came home with a new phone case she had bought on her lunch break and mentioned, almost as an aside, that the store was right next to the dealership and she had asked them to check the tire pressure while she was out. She said it with zero awareness of how it sounded, or maybe full awareness, and she simply did not care. I rode the bicycle. In October, it was fine. In November, it was cold. In December, the back tire went flat. I asked my dad to fix it 3 times before I stopped asking. I walked when the distance was short enough. When it wasn't, I asked my mother to drive me somewhere, and she usually would, with a brief comment about how I really needed to think about getting my own transportation sorted out. She said this as though my transportation situation were a personal failing that had nothing to do with her. There were days I looked at the driveway and felt something close to rage, and then felt frightened by the rage because it seemed disproportionate, which I now understand was precisely the point of the whole arrangement. The constant low-grade reframing of my reality, "You're tired, you're not thinking straight, you're lucky we're helping you," had done its work. By November, I could barely trust my own reactions. By January, Cole was 4 months old. The maternity leave was technically over, but I had not returned to work yet because the logistics of childcare had not been sorted out. My mother had managed that question in a way that kept it perpetually unresolved. I had begun to feel the edges of something I later came to understand as a kind of fog. Not depression exactly, but a slow erosion of the sense that my own perceptions were reliable. I would think, maybe she is right that I am too tired to drive. Maybe Lauren needing the car is more urgent. Maybe I should be grateful for the structure. This is what sustained control does to a person. It does not announce itself. It seeps. The morning of the walk, I woke at 5:30 because Cole was hungry. After feeding him, I went to check the formula. We were almost out. The canister was empty. My mother had taken the car the night before and had not returned. I could have knocked on her door. She was asleep upstairs. But I already knew how that conversation would go. There would be a version of events in which the formula situation was, somehow, a result of my poor planning. There would be a suggestion that I should have flagged this sooner. There would be help extended in a manner that made clear the help was an act of charity. I put Cole in the carrier. I put on 3 layers. I walked to the pharmacy. It was a 1.5 miles away, 28 degrees. Cole slept against my chest for most of it, which was the only mercy. I was on the way back when I heard a car slow down behind me. I turned. It was my grandfather's car. The rear window came down. He looked at me. He looked at Cole. He looked at the bag on my shoulder, and the road, and the temperature, and the absence of any car. "Why are you walking in this weather?" he asked. "And where's the Mercedes I gave you?" I turned away. Not because I was ashamed of the answer, but because I was afraid of what would happen when I said it out loud, to him, in a context where it could no longer be managed or explained away. I had held this particular truth so carefully for so long that I was not sure what would break open when I released it. Then I said it. "I've never driven it. My sister has it." The silence from the car was complete. Then, "Get in." I did not think. I opened the door and the warm air hit me like something physical. Cole stirred and resettled. I looked straight ahead. My grandfather did not say anything for a long moment. Then, "How long?" "Since October," I said. He nodded once. Then, "I'll fix this tonight." We did not go back to my parents' house. He told the driver to take us to his estate 20 minutes away and called ahead to have a room and a crib prepared. I did not argue. I think I was in a kind of shock. Not the medical kind, but the shock of having been seen, of having said the true thing out loud, of being in a warm car moving away from a situation I had been unable to leave on my own. "Is the car all of it?" he asked quietly, after several minutes. "No," I said. "Tell me." So I did. I told him about the bank account, the way my mother had taken my debit card in the 3rd week, framed as help, and never returned it. The withdrawals I had noticed on my phone statements, amounts too large, categories that didn't correspond to household needs, patterns I kept trying to make sense of and kept explaining away, because trusting my own read on the situation had become something I no longer knew how to do. I told him about the trust paperwork that had never arrived, and how once, carefully, I had asked my mother about it, and she had said she hadn't seen anything, and I should contact the attorney if I was concerned. And then the next day, she had rearranged Cole's entire sleep schedule in a way that absorbed the rest of the week, and I had not followed up. I told him about the pediatrician appointments, about Lauren and the car, car about my father who watched the news. When I finished, the car was pulling through the gates of his estate. He looked at me and said very calmly, "Olivia, I am going to make some calls." He made 3 calls before the car reached the front door. I heard fragments: the name Holt, the phrase financial forensics, the words tomorrow morning. His voice was the voice he used for business, precise, cold, without negotiation. That night, I slept for 6 uninterrupted hours. Cole slept in the crib the staff had prepared. When I woke at 3 in the morning and lay in the dark, I felt something I had almost forgotten the texture of: the sensation of being somewhere safe. In the morning, Richard Holt arrived at 9. He was a compact, precise man in his early 60s with silver-framed glasses. My grandfather's personal attorney for over 20 years, and my grandfather explained briefly, someone who had handled more than a few cases involving family financial misconduct. He set a legal pad on the table and looked at me. "I'd like you to walk me through everything, from the beginning." It took 2 hours. Holt asked about dates, specific amounts, whether I had signed anything, what had happened to the trust documents, whether my mother had communicated in writing about the spending she was managing on my behalf. I answered everything I could. Cole slept in a portable bassinet in the corner. Holt listened without reacting, which I found steadying in the way that competent professional neutrality can be steadying. It suggested that what I was describing, however disorienting it still felt to me, was something he had the tools to address. When I finished, Holt looked at my grandfather. "There are 2 distinct issues. The first is the vehicle, straightforward conversion of property. The second is the financial access, which is more significant." He turned to me. "Your grandfather tells me the trust was $150,000, with a specific purpose clause for your benefit and the child's future. If those documents were intercepted, if someone removed them before you received them, and if money has been moved without your knowledge or consent, we are looking at something considerably more serious than a family dispute about a car." He picked up his phone and called Marcus Caldwell, a forensic accountant specializing in financial crimes, someone Holt had worked with on prior cases and trusted completely. Caldwell would begin pulling full transaction records on every account associated with me once they had a court order for the trust. "How quickly can we get the order?" my grandfather asked. "For an emergency asset preservation order, given these circumstances, I can have it in front of a judge this afternoon. We document the withdrawal pattern. We get a freeze on all affected accounts before anyone can move anything else." He looked at me. "Once we file, this becomes a legal proceeding. Your parents and sister will be notified. This does not stay inside the family." "I understand," I said. "Are you comfortable with that?" I looked at Cole, asleep in the corner. I thought about the empty formula canister at 5:30 in the morning. I thought about 28 degrees and a mile and a half with a baby strapped to my chest. "Yes," I said. "File it." Marcus Caldwell arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Heavy-set, mid-40s, with an easy manner and the kind of face that made you think he coached youth baseball on weekends. He sat up at the dining room table with his laptop and a portable scanner and spent 3 hours in near silence going through every account I could access, occasionally asking a clarifying question in the flat, procedural tone of someone for whom financial crime was simply a category of problem to be solved. At one point he said, without looking up, "Did you authorize a wire transfer to a residential renovation contractor in November?" I said no. He typed something and went back to work. At 6 in the evening, he turned the laptop so I could see the screen. A spreadsheet, color-coded, red for flagged items. There was a lot of red. "From your personal checking account," he said, "I'm seeing $41,200 in outflows over 8 months that are inconsistent with normal household expenses. A contractor payment of $11,000 to a residential renovation company. A retail purchase of nearly $5,000 at a luxury goods retailer. A series of cash withdrawals totaling just over $9,000. And transfers into an account I flagged for further review." He paused. "That's just the checking account. The trust? I've just begun pulling those records following the order. But the preliminary picture is that the account established in your name at $150,000 has a current balance of approximately $68,000. The room went quiet. "So they took money from the trust too," my grandfather said, not a question. "It appears someone established signatory access to that account. I don't yet know how. That's what I'll be working through overnight. But the short version, roughly $80,000 has exited accounts belonging to Olivia over the course of 8 months. I looked at the spreadsheet. $80,000. I tried to make the number feel real and could not. It was not the money itself. It was what each transaction represented. Every withdrawal was a decision. Every transfer was a choice made deliberately, in full knowledge of what it was. While I rode a bicycle in January. "Who will be charged?" I asked. Holt answered carefully. "That depends on what the investigation shows. Your mother had primary access. Whether your sister and father had knowledge or participation in the transactions is something we'll determine through discovery. But at minimum, we're looking at financial fraud, theft by conversion, and, given the trust, probable breach of fiduciary duty." He folded his hands. "I want to be honest with you about what comes next. This will be hard. Your family will not cooperate quietly. There will be attempts to discredit you, your mental state, your stability as a mother, your reliability as a witness. We need to prepare for that." "They've already started," I said. He nodded once. "Then we're ahead of them." Holt filed the fraud report that night and contacted the bank directly. By the following morning, my accounts were frozen and transferred into my sole control pending investigation. That night, I called Daniel. I had been sending him carefully edited updates for weeks, reassurances that everything was fine, that Cole was thriving, that I was managing. I hadn't told him the truth because I was afraid of what it costs a deployed soldier to learn that something is badly wrong at home, and there is nothing he can do about it from across the world. But Holt had made it clear that Daniel needed to know before my family reached him first and shaped the story. The video call connected at 10:30, literally his time. He was in a small room with a metal wall behind him. He looked tired in the particular way deployed soldiers look tired, a tiredness that has become structural, built into the posture and the eyes. "Hey," he said. "How's Cole?" "He's good. He's asleep." "Daniel, I need to tell you some things, and I need you to hear all of them before you respond." His face shifted. He went into the listening mode I had watched him use our entire marriage. Present, contained, not yet reacting. I told him everything. It took 40 minutes. Several times he started to say something and stopped himself. When I finished, he was quiet. $80,000, he said finally. "That's the preliminary number." Another silence. Then, "Your mom called me 2 weeks ago. She said you were struggling, that the postpartum was hitting harder than you were letting on, that you were sometimes confused, not quite." He paused. "She said she was worried about you. I know she called you. Something about it felt off. I should have called you directly instead of letting it sit. You couldn't have known what you were walking into. I should have trusted my instinct." He rubbed his face with both hands. "What do you need from me?" "Contact the JAG office. Holt believes military family protection statutes apply here. Federal dimensions when a service member's family is targeted in financial fraud during deployment. He wants to connect with your legal officer. I'll call Captain Morrow first thing in the morning." No hesitation, no deliberation. He had moved from emotion to action in the way I had watched him do our entire marriage, and I found it, as always, steadying. "What else?" "Just believe me," I said. "Olivia." His voice was quiet. "I believe you completely. I have believed you the whole time. I am sorry I didn't push harder when something felt wrong." After we hung up, I sat in the dark with Cole asleep across my lap for a long time. I felt something I had not felt in months, the specific relief of being known by the person whose knowing matters most. It was a different kind of warmth than the estate's central heating, something that started from the inside and moved outward. The following morning brought two developments in quick succession. First, the emergency asset preservation order had been granted. All accounts were legally frozen. No further withdrawals could be made by anyone but me. Second, Sergeant Anita Reyes of the County Sheriff's Financial Crimes Unit, assigned to the fraud report Holt had filed the prior evening, had already attempted to contact my parents. My mother had declined to speak without an attorney present. She knew, whatever story my mother had been telling herself, that this was a misunderstanding, that Olivia would come to her senses, that Grandpa's involvement was temporary. That story had collapsed overnight. The bank had notified her the accounts were frozen. Someone, probably an attorney she had reached by phone, had explained what a criminal fraud filing with the Financial Crimes Unit actually meant. I found out later there had been a series of calls between my mother, my father, and Lauren throughout that morning. My father had said, on at least one of those calls, words to the effect of, "I told you this would go too far." That is the first and only thing my father did in this story that I have any feeling of sympathy toward. Sergeant Reyes came to my grandfather's estate that afternoon. She was compact and unhurried, with a quality of attention that reminded me of a good teacher. She asked me to walk her through the timeline. She asked about specific transactions. She asked whether my mother had ever communicated in writing about the spending she was managing on my behalf. I pulled up my phone. There was a text from November. My mother saying the budget was tighter than expected, and that I might need to be more careful about what I was requesting, as though the account were hers, and I were a dependent asking for an allowance. Reyes read the message. Her partner wrote something down. "One more question. Your sister, did she ever acknowledge, directly or indirectly, that she understood the car was yours?" I thought about it. There was a text from December. Lauren had mentioned she was thinking of getting the Mercedes detailed for the holidays. I had said nothing. She had replied with a short laugh. "Don't worry, I'll take good care of it." I showed Reyes the text. She looked at it, then handed my phone back. "Thank you," she said. "We have enough to move forward." Caldwell's full report arrived on the fourth day. 47 pages. Holt walked me through the significant findings over 2 hours. The number was worse than the preliminary estimate. Across my personal checking account and the trust fund, $82,640. The full report identified several months of transfers from the trust to a second checking account opened solely in my mother's name. This was the mechanism, not forged documents, as Holt had initially suspected, but something more brazen. My mother had taken the trust documentation mailed to my parents' address before I moved in, and had arranged, using her own identity and a form that bore my signature, to establish herself as co-signatory. The form with my signature. Holt set down the page. "I need to ask you something. Is it possible that early in your stay, your mother presented you with papers she described as standard financial administration, possibly when you were very tired, and you signed without reading carefully?" I thought about it. There had been a day in October, Cole perhaps 3 weeks old, when my mother had brought me a set of papers and said they were administrative matters related to the trust. She had been matter-of-fact. She pointed to a line and handed me a pen. I had been nursing Cole at the time, and I scrawled a signature without reading what was in front of me. "Yes," I said. "I think so." Holt nodded. "We will argue, successfully, that any signature obtained in that manner, from a postpartum woman in the 3rd week after birth, not given adequate opportunity to read or understand the document, is not a valid authorization, especially given what the document purported to authorize." Can they argue it was legitimate? They can argue anything. But the circumstances under which it was signed, the pattern of concealment, the movement of funds to accounts solely in your mother's name, and the specific purpose clause in the trust documents, all of that creates a very strong inference of deliberate fraud. He paused. "Olivia, I want to be direct. What your mother did with that trust document was not impulsive. It was not a mistake. She understood what she was doing. She had a plan." That was the sentence that finally made me cry. Not the $82,000, not the car, not any individual thing that had been taken. It was the recognition that this had been been deliberate from the beginning, that the careful, concerned face my mother had worn for 8 months had been, at least in part, a performance designed to maintain my cooperation while she took what she wanted. I cried for about 4 minutes. Then I stopped. I felt cleaner after it, the way you feel after being sick, emptied of something that had been making everything worse. What happens next? I asked. The civil complaint is ready to file, Holt said. Once filed and served, we move into formal proceedings. The criminal track continues in parallel. The DA's office has reviewed Captain Morrow's JAG documentation. The active duty dimension adds federal weight they find significant. They're inclined to pursue criminal charges. He looked at me across the table. I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully. There is a version of this in which we pursue the civil case aggressively and accept a settlement that returns your money and your property with a protective order without pushing for criminal prosecution. Faster, more certain. There is another version in which we press fully on both tracks. Longer, more public, harder. Both are legitimate choices. I thought about the formula canister. The signature I had put on a document I did not read 3 weeks postpartum while nursing a newborn. The trust money, set aside specifically for Cole's future, systematically emptied into my mother's accounts over 8 months. Both tracks, I said. The day the civil complaint was filed, my phone began ringing before 9 in the morning. My mother called 4 times. I did not answer. The first voicemail was concerned. Olivia, please, we need to talk. There has been a terrible misunderstanding. The second voicemail was different. By the second, her voice had shifted into something I recognized from childhood. The tone she used when she felt her authority was being challenged and found that it wasn't working. She said I was being manipulated by my grandfather, that I wasn't thinking clearly, that whatever I thought had happened was not what it seemed. I saved both voicemails and sent them to Holt. Lauren sent a text. Olivia, why are you doing this to us? My father did not contact me at all. 2 days after the complaint was filed, I was told that my mother and father had retained a defense attorney. Lauren had retained a separate one. The fact that they obtained separate representation told Holt something important. When family members facing joint civil liability retain different attorneys, it generally means they are beginning to assess their own individual exposure rather than presenting a united front. They're already starting to protect themselves from each other, Holt said, with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a predicted sequence unfold. Sergeant Reyes called that same week. Her preliminary investigation was complete, and she had referred the case to the county district attorney with a recommendation for formal charges. The DA had accepted. My mother would be charged with financial fraud, theft by deception, and breach of fiduciary duty related to the trust. Lauren would be charged with receiving stolen property. The charges were formal. They would appear on a docket. My family was being prosecuted. I sat with that for a long time after the call. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the strange dislocation of watching something you have been in the middle of become suddenly something happening in official institutions, courtrooms, dockets, criminal files. The thing that had been invisible and private was now formal and public. The invisible architecture of control that had been dismantling me month by month was being rendered into evidence, exhibits, case numbers. Then, slowly, I felt something that was not quite relief and not quite satisfaction, but was adjacent to both. Grandpa visited me at the estate that evening. He sat across from me in the library with 2 cups of tea and the fire going and said, without preamble, "You made the right call." "I'm not sure what the right call is anymore," I said. "I just made a call." He looked at me for a moment. "The capacity to act under uncertainty is the only real courage there is," he said. "Everything else is just calculation." Daniel came home 6 weeks before his official leave date. The JAG office, citing documented criminal targeting of his family during deployment, had advocated for emergency family hardship leave. It was approved. I did not know he was coming until he was at the door of the estate with a duffel bag and a face that had aged about 3 years in 8 months. He held Cole for a long time without putting him down. He sat on the floor of the room with Cole in his lap and just looked at him, memorizing him, recalibrating to the fact of him at 4 months versus the newborn he had left. Then he held me for a long time without saying anything. Then he sat down and ate an entire plate of food one of my grandfather's staff had prepared, and he looked at me across the table and said, "Tell me what I can do." The civil case went to mediation before it reached trial. My mother's attorney made an initial offer that Holt rejected without discussion. 2 more sessions followed, the last one with a professional mediator present. The settlement agreement. My mother and father would pay full restitution on all amounts withdrawn from my accounts and the trust, $82,640, plus interest calculated from the date of each withdrawal, plus Holt's legal fees. Total, just over $96,000. To fund the settlement, they were required to liquidate assets. They sold the house. Lauren's separate settlement required payment of the assessed rental value of the Mercedes across 8 months, plus a sum reflecting the luxury goods purchased with funds traced to my accounts. $11,300. She paid it from savings and a loan from a friend. The Mercedes was returned to me on a Thursday morning. The officer who handled the return drove it to my grandfather's estate and handed me the keys in the driveway. Lauren had replaced the original air freshener with a new one. There was a small dent on the rear bumper that had not been there in October. I noted it and said nothing. A permanent protective order was issued. My parents and Lauren were prohibited from contacting us, directly or through intermediaries. Violation would result in immediate arrest. On the criminal track, my mother pleaded guilty to reduced charges, financial fraud, and 1 count of theft, in exchange for a suspended sentence, 3 years of probation, and mandatory financial restitution counseling. The plea avoided trial. It also meant a permanent criminal record. Lauren's receiving stolen property charge was resolved through a diversion program conditioned on payment of her civil settlement. No jail time for either of them. I had mixed feelings about that, and I let myself have them, and then I let them go. My father was not charged. He signed an affidavit as part of the civil proceedings detailing what he had known and when. I do not know what his life looks like now. I find that I do not think about it very often. The apartment Daniel and I found was on the 3rd floor of a building 12 minutes from my grandfather's estate. 2 bedrooms, a small balcony facing east so that in the mornings, if Cole woke early, I could take him out in the first light and watch the neighborhood come awake. It was the first home that was entirely ours. No one else's fixtures, no one else's schedule, no one else's kitchen where someone else sorted the mail. We moved in on a Saturday in March. My grandfather came with 2 staff members who carried boxes without being asked and left after 2 hours with a quiet nod that I understood to mean, "You're all right from here." Daniel's best friend from the unit drove up from the base and helped assemble furniture, and we ate pizza on the floor of the living room while Cole supervised from his bouncer and occasionally expressed opinions about the situation. That night, after Cole was down and Daniel was asleep, I went down to the parking lot. I had not driven the Mercedes yet. I had sat in it once in the driveway at the estate just to feel what it felt like, but I had not driven it. I got in, I adjusted the seat and the mirrors, I put my hands on the steering wheel. The car smelled like new upholstery and faintly like Lauren's air freshener, something synthetic and floral that I found I did not mind. I did not start the engine right away. I sat in the quiet dark of the parking lot and held the steering wheel and felt the weight of the previous 8 months settle into something I could carry. My car, my hands, my name on the registration, my son upstairs in his crib in his own room, my husband asleep in our bed, my grandfather's number in my phone, which he had told me to use anytime for anything with a simplicity that told me he meant it. I had spent 8 months disappearing by degrees inside a house where every surface had been claimed by someone else. I had handed over my card and my keys and my confidence and my version of events, one small surrender at a time, because I was too exhausted to do otherwise and because I had not understood until I was standing on a frozen road with a baby on my chest that I had a choice. I had a choice. I had always had a choice. I just needed someone to remind me that the choice was mine to make. I sat in the car for a long time. Then I started the engine. The sound of it was low and certain and entirely mine. I pulled out of the parking lot and drove through the quiet streets of our new neighborhood, the heater running, the city lights strung out around me, Cole asleep upstairs, Daniel asleep upstairs, my grandfather 12 minutes away, the road ahead open and unhurried and belonging to no one but me. I drove for 20 minutes. Then I went home.